Hi, I'm Joy Mayer. I'm the Director of Trusting News, and I'm going to talk today about what we do at Trusting News and how we work with newsrooms. Since we started the work in 2016, we have considered ourselves to be in a continual cycle of learning. We work with academic researchers, we partner with newsrooms who are willing to experiment and try things out, and we are continually coming up with new strategies and revising what we thought worked as we learn more about what helps build trust with audiences. Let me talk you through some basic principles that guide our work. The first is that we can't persuade everyone to trust us. It's really natural if one of your first inclinations when you think about trying to build trust with audiences is, what's the point? Those people yelling at us in the comments aren't going to believe us no matter what we do, so why bother? I completely agree that there are people who are likely never going to trust what you do, and you have to set them aside. There are a lot of people in the middle of the spectrum, though, between your biggest fans and the people who will never trust you. There are a lot of people who are confused about what to trust and are looking for signals to help them figure out what's credible, who maybe have come up with efficient paths to deciding what credible information looks like, but are open to new information, to kind of some guidance about how that works. So we focus on those people in the middle. The second principle that's related is that being a news consumer is really confusing and overwhelming. I hear from people all the time who are struggling to tell whether a headline that their friend shared is credible or not. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell. Also, some people have a lot of sort of a more casual approach to how they interact with news, certainly more than journalists do. People sort of take whatever headlines come at them ambiently, whatever they see when they're running at the gym, whatever shows up in their Facebook feed, and they don't have a checklist that they keep by their computer where they decide, like, should I trust this source? Should I not? And they have developed their own systems for it and maybe don't think too critically about it. And I think that journalists have a real opportunity to be a trusted guide to navigating the complicated news landscape. Because people often have a casual relationship with the news, I think it's probably safe to say they have a more casual relationship with the news than journalists do. So we're the ones whose existence depends on repairing this broken relationship. And even though we could easily make a list of all the things we wish people would do to be smarter news consumers and to give us a fighting chance to earn their trust and to question the assumptions and the misassumptions they have about our work, fundamentally, we believe that it's up to us to do that work, to do the outreach, to be responsive to people's concerns, to and help guide them to consuming our news as a responsible, healthy information source. A few more basic principles. We think it's super important to acknowledge that not all journalism is good. There are plenty of times that I consume the news and think, oh my gosh, what are they doing? And I just want to yell at the TV or slam the computer shut. Any complaint somebody has about journalism, I'm sure we could all find plenty of examples for where that complaint is warranted. Places where they don't take accuracy seriously enough, where they're sensationalizing stories to get clicks, where we wonder if the financial side of news is influencing how things get covered, where there's a kind of a hidden agenda that the journalists aren't upfront about or critical enough of. So I think it would be a good idea for us to reward that skepticism, to validate the skepticism and say, of course, you shouldn't trust everything you see that comes from a news site. Here is how you can know that you can trust us. Here's what sets our work apart. Another principle I want to share with you is one from research that compares the idea of cognitive trust and effective trust. Cognitive trust is the head. That's the list of facts. So I can make for you a bulleted list of facts about what makes my journalism credible. Here are policies, here are our practices, here's how we check behind each other. We do this, we don't do this. And then we feel real good. Journalists are real comfortable with lists of facts, right? But the problem is that if you don't believe in the basic integrity of somebody talking to you, it doesn't matter what facts they share, because you don't feel like you're operating for the same team. You don't feel like you have the same goals. You don't feel like they're operating with integrity. So the same way fact-checking research bears this out, that people don't trust a fact check, no matter how rock solid it seems, if they don't trust the people doing the fact checking. I think you can see how that's true in interpersonal relationships. I'm going to believe what you say if I think you're believable. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many fancy words you throw at me, I'm not going to buy it. So journalists tend to be really comfortable with the idea of cognitive trust, but the effective trust is more the engagement piece of it. It's more the, how do we open ourselves up? How do we show some humanity? How do we listen and make people feel heard? Are we responsive to concerns? And do we sort of share things about ourselves that we know will help people find us credible? The last point here is we don't get automatic credit for things we do that the audience can't see. So all the times that we stand around a desk or hang out in Slack channels debating, should we cover this story? Who should we talk to for this story? How much attention should we give this story? What words should we use? What images should we use? All of that is invisible unless we tell people about it. So a lot of what we do at Trusting News is about making the invisible visible. That's what transparency really means to us. So we work a lot on transparency and on being clear about what we're offering, being clear about why we're covering something and whether something's opinion or news, where the content comes from, what ethical frameworks drive the work, that sort of thing. We do a lot of work on engagement and responsiveness, which also involves listening and showing up with humility, being willing to accept feedback and to respond respectfully to it. We talk a lot about articulating a counter narrative. So if somebody has an accusation about your work, where could they find the answer? If they think that you only have a paywall, for example, because you're greedy, well, where on your website do you explain why you have a paywall and what your sources of funding are and why you rely on community support? That would be your counter narrative. And then we also believe in the idea of taking advantage of attention where you have it. So it's a great first step to have a page on your website where you list your ethics policies that you follow. It is another thing to, on a story page, say, we made this decision in today's story, which is consistent with our ethics policies, and link back to it. Because where people care about your ethics is where they're reading a story that makes them wonder why you made that decision or whether they can trust your decision. Most people don't hang out on a news website poking around on the About Us page and that sort of thing, saying, oh, I wonder if they have ethics policies listed. So we really believe in baking the transparency into the journalism whenever possible. So here's an example of what one of our newsroom partners did to answer questions about their work. The Seattle Times investigative team asked their audience what they were curious about. What would you like to know about how our investigative team works? And so here's some of the questions they got. Are you politically biased? How does your mostly white team authentically represent and report on communities of color? Who decides what gets covered? Does the editorial board influence what you investigate? So they compiled these questions and then they created a Q&A on their website. Here are answers to your questions. What I love about this is that each of these questions is a link down to a section of the page, an anchor tag further down on the page. So that what that means is that each explanation is linkable on its own, not just the overall headline. So if somebody on their team gets a question in an email from someone who says, I bet you're only doing this story because of this, or I think you probably are bringing this particular bias or agenda to it, or I bet this person makes your decisions, or even without the negative tone, who on your team decides what you investigate? Well, they don't have to start from scratch with the language. They can actually link straight to that section of their FAQ. They can do that from comments. If you're replying to comments on a social platform like Facebook, you can say, actually, here's how we operate. We're happy. We're on the record about that. We're happy to share it with you. Let us know if you have more questions. So that really increases the efficiency because you're not having to come up with explanations from scratch or even go find it and copy and paste. You can just link to it. So what I want to do now is walk through some basic questions that I invite you to ask about your own work and how familiar it's reasonable to think that your audience is with some of your basic practices. And this, I hope, will give you sort of an overview of the types of things we work with newsrooms on. So up first is, what do people know about your ethics and policies? So one of our newsroom partners, the Burlington Free Press in Vermont, decided to not use the full name of a source in a story about youth athlete concussions. And they included this paragraph in the story. This woman agreed to share her daughter's story as long as we didn't use her full name for fear that her daughter's concussion could adversely affect her college recruitment chances. super reasonable request on their part. The newspaper decided to honor it. So what you need to know is that anonymous sources are one of those things that journalists take for granted in terms of it being fairly rare, and that we have kind of a pretty typical formal system for deciding to do that in most cases. That, you know, the reporter has to check with an editor, and then often a member of management has to be involved as well. There are criteria, right? We would only do it if there's no other way to tell the story, if they're you know, if we think that, you know, there's some validity to their concerns about being named, that sort of thing. But people don't know that. There are actually some people who think that when we say anonymous source, that the source is anonymous to the journalist, that we don't even know who it is. That is the level of that's the extent to which people do not understand what we do. And so we can be frustrated by that and think that that's silly, but fundamentally we're the ones that it hurts if people don't believe it or are making all kinds of assumptions about why we wanted to protect these people specifically, or any other misassumption that people might have about what our reason would be for granting this special permission and acquiescing to their request. So the Burlington Free Press put this in the story, and you can see that it links to a longer explanation. So they have a whole story about how they handled this request for privacy and how it's consistent. They handle these requests consistently. Second thing I want to ask you is, what do people know about what you cover and why you cover it? This is actually one of the most foundational questions we see when we do user research, is that people want to know how we decide what news is. And, you know, I think one of the reasons journalists don't talk about it very much is because there's not a formula or an algorithm. It's not like we plug the factors of an issue in and it spits back out, oh, there's a 7.2% chance that this would be a good story. We know that there's so much human judgment. Honestly, staffing affects it, right? Like who's on duty and what did they find interesting, or who called in sick, so we couldn't cover that thing we were going to cover, or the intern's here today and didn't have anything to do, so we decided to cover this. So many factors. And I think that leads us to just not talk about it very much, because we think that we'll be sort of held accountable for always doing it the exact same way. But what that leads to is a lot of misassumptions people have. So let's look at some examples. We saw TV stations and newsrooms in general really getting questions early in COVID about why they were covering how many people died of COVID and not how many people recovered from it. As you can imagine, harbinger of things to come, what we saw was a lot of accusations about the integrity of the decision. People assuming that journalists wanted to exaggerate the effects of COVID, that we were somehow on the side of people who were making COVID seem like a big deal, and that we were purposefully hiding how many people recovered because we wanted it to seem scarier. So this is a TV station in Ohio that addressed it head on and created a story, good SEO here, created a story about why that is a number that isn't actually tracked by the state. Nobody has that number. So there's not like a database we can refer to and pull that into our stats. And I had a public health official talking about why. So you can wish that people didn't think that. And the reaction in a lot of newsrooms would be to see those comments and say, gosh, they just don't know what they're talking about, or if only they understood. But they don't have it as part of their routine to actually then explain it, and to do it in a way that you can link back to. Not to spend the time answering one email or even one Facebook comment, but to instead make it part of your coverage to explain why that reporting decision has been made. Another way to get on the record about things is to create a landing page that will be useful throughout a project. Our partners at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution created a landing page for their recent mayoral election, and it laid out what their goals were in covering the election, why this is really important, and they were investing significant resources into it. And then they also included elements like, here are the top issues we'll be covering. We're going to be focusing our reporting attention on these issues. Here's where we get our information. Here are the official sources that we trust. There was also a section with a photo and some bios that introduced the staffers who were primarily assigned to cover the race. And what we heard from their staff after this was published is that the time spent was well spent, because of the increased efficiency later when people had questions. Why are you covering this? Or PR staffers for candidates, why aren't you covering this? Or why are you focusing on this? And they were able to point them back to something and saying, look, we told you all along and we're being consistent. You're welcome to hold us accountable for sticking to what we told you we were going to do. Another example from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel was when covering protests in their community, They kept an eye on the questions they were getting. And I want to say that the questions are not always framed as questions in good faith. A lot of times they're framed as attacks or misassumptions. So you're only doing this because of this, or you want this to happen, and so you're using this word. For us at Trusting News, we see those as information gaps, things that are not understood about your journalism. And so we reframe them as questions. And that's what they did here in Milwaukee. They collected the things that they wanted people to know about how they were making decisions on this really intense and high profile story topic. And they created a story file that said, here are answers to your questions. And they framed it as a Q&A. Here was one section that was about word choice. Why are you calling these riots? And they talked about riot versus protest, how events get characterized, and why they chose the words that they chose. They took that Q&A to Instagram and let people swipe through the questions and the answers, and reached a whole different audience there, and it did really well for them. One of the things that we get excited about at Trusting News is when our newsroom partners update their CMS or their technology to allow for easier embedding of transparency elements. Here's what our partners at the San Francisco Chronicle did, built into their CMS an expandable box that could go anywhere in the story. And it starts off short, and you can see that the text grays out, and then users can click to expand it. And that means that anywhere in the story, they're able to say, here's something we want you to know about how this story was reported. On the left here is another example of something similar, a longer FAQ with a story of a newsroom partner back before Gatehouse Media merged with Gannett. And they were able to embed parts of their longer FAQ about their investigation into specific points of the story. Take advantage of attention where you have it. So when they quoted something, they were able to say, oh, people are going to wonder why we use those sources. And then they're able to pull that element in. I'm also intrigued by the idea of putting it up at the top of the story. This is from Pew Research, actually, and they have an option within their reporting to have expandable boxes just up under the byline. It's like, if you want to know some of the background about how our process here, you can expand it if you like. I think another question we like to ask with newsrooms is, who is covering the news, and what do people get to know about who is covering the news? Where can that add to the sort of either cognitive trust, the credibility of people in terms of their credentials, or the effective trust? How can learning about people make them more relatable and seem then more credible? So 2 quick social media examples. The social news gathering team at NBC took a Zoom screen grab and introduced the folks who were behind the scenes. And on the right, when we were working with the Christian Science Monitor, they did Instagram stories interviewing journalists, asking them about their backgrounds. Here's one where Peter was talking about all the different countries he'd reported from. And then I think on the next section, they talked about why his socks always match his shirt. So, it's up to you how personal you get, but even just the smallest amount of relatability can really help. The New York Times has actually started experimenting with this. They, under their bylines, they have started to include some biographical information that is not the reporter's standard bio, but relates to this story. So here we see Andrew has reported from more than 25 countries. And for this story, he was reporting from inside the Olympic bubble in Beijing. And then the story on the right, Amanda Morris covers disability issues using her own experiences as a disabled person to inform her reporting, which is a whole nother level of credibility and authenticity, I think, for the perspective the reporter's coming from. I think a lot of us would probably agree that one of the common themes we see in the feedback and complaints we get is that people don't trust us to be fair. They don't assume that we are approaching our coverage from a perspective of wanting to represent diverse viewpoints with an open mind and in good faith. So what occurs to me a lot is that we're not actually on the record. We don't have a counter narrative to that. We're not often articulating how it is that we work to be fair. Here's an example from our partners at PolitiFact when they were during the last presidential election cycle, when they covered the Democratic National Convention and then the Republican National Convention. They were noticing some similar themes in questions they got from people throughout that coverage. And their editor, Angie Holan, in her email at the end of the Republican convention, had a section in the email that addressed reader questions. And here are 2 questions that she addressed. One is, where's your fact checking of the Democrats? because people had been tuned in during the Republican National Convention, and not all of them had tuned in the week before. And they're seeing the PolitiFact journalists fact checking the Republicans and feeling like the same accountability might not have been there for the Democrats. So we really believe that it's important for journalists to remember that that's reasonable. People will tune in to just part of coverage. We can wish that before they asked a question or leapt to an assumption, they would go look and see if we had covered the Democrats the week before. It's fine for us to wish that. That doesn't make them do it. And it's better for us to treat the question in good faith and answer it in good faith and say, actually, we did approach. Here's where you can find all the similar coverage we did last week. We're committed to fact checking both parties. If you think we've missed something, please let me know. I loved how she handled that with some humility and diplomacy. The second question is, you seem to fact check Republicans more than Democrats. Are you biased? And she says, we don't try to make either party or any particular politician look bad or good. We work hard to hold everyone accountable to the same basic set of standards. And then she links to that basic set of standards because they had it online. Then she says, we do tend to fact check provocative statements that sound wrong. So if some people get fact checked more, that might be why. This example, which I love, is from the San Diego Union Tribune. They have, as part of their ethics policies in their About Us section, a fairness checklist. We will not hesitate to decline to publish a story that fails to meet our standards. So let's look at what is on that fairness checklist. Things like, we ensure that the word choices and the overall tone of stories are fair and neutral. We prevent a diversity of views in their best light. We ensure there are no surprises in the story for our subjects. We give subjects ample time to respond, generally speaking, a minimum of 24 hours. I think it's the fact that they articulate what fairness looks like is really powerful. Now, in my dream world, this would be referenced from day-to-day stories. You would come across a story and it would say, so-and-so was not available or didn't respond to our request for comment. And you could say, in accordance with our fairness checklist, and link to it, he was given 24 hours to respond. We'll update the story if we hear back later. Instead of assuming that because you have a fairness checklist on your website, people will find it. I would love to see us do that with ethics policies all the time. Let me just circle back to the topic of money for a minute. People have a lot of assumptions about how money impacts journalism. And of course, some of them are accurate. I mean, we do cover things that we think people will pay for, right? That will cause people to convert to subscribers. In some cases, of course, there are places where journalism is influenced by advertising, where people do or don't cover something because of the dollar effect that it might have on the business. Many of us have been lucky enough not to work in newsrooms where that's the case, but we certainly can't say that in the large media landscape, it's never the case. So our hope is that responsible journalists will explain that really clearly and not assume that they're getting automatic credit for it. So one example is explaining how funding doesn't influence coverage. This is a story from NPR, and Steve Inskeep, as part of the on-air story, says, in a story about Amazon, we will tell you that Amazon is a financial supporter of NPR News, and we are raising these questions about Amazon all the same, which is how it should work. Don't assume that people understand. A lot of times what you'll see is just the first part of that, sort of a quick disclosure that says NPR gets money from Amazon, without that second part that says, but we have systems in place to make sure that that funding does not influence our news decisions. We have done some work with newsrooms to show how trust building strategies can connect to financial sustainability. With PolitiFact specifically, we did a newsletter test, sending out over a period of months different messaging to half of their big national newsletter. And the half of the newsletter that got more behind the scenes information about the ethics and values of the organization, and that got different language around the donation button that highlighted the sort of value that PolitiFact offers, the half that got that messaging was more likely to click on the donation button and rated the organization higher in general as well. A quick note about opinion and news coverage. There are a lot of reasons that people think that there is too much opinion in the news, and I think there are a lot of valid reasons that people have that complaint. But fundamentally, it's really important that we don't let the confusion be about whether a piece of content is actually designed to share an opinion or not. And that's what's most frustrating, is that too often I see content and can't tell that it is designed to share an opinion. So when it's done well, here's an example from the New York Times. You'll see on the left how something appeared online, the big opinion label, a byline that says the editorial board, which is clickable and will tell you all about the editorial board and who's on it. And then a description that shows up on the story page under the byline that says, this is a group of opinion journalists. It is separate from the newsroom. Then when that story is pasted onto a Facebook feed, you notice that the word opinion is moved to the beginning of the headline. Their system is set up so that that happens automatically, that they have a headline field for social that has the word opinion at the beginning of it, so that as people scroll through in their feed, they're not going to see a headline that says, don't let the games begin, here's what college athletics needs to do, that looks like a news story, which is so often the case, that the label disappears when something is taken to social or into an app or into a news aggregator, and the designation of opinion is lost. So it's important to double check that and see how your stories travel to different platforms. That is it for our quick introduction to trusting news. If you want to see what this looks like day to day in newsrooms, subscribe to our Trust Tips newsletter. We share one quick tip each week for earning trust. Thank you very much for your time today.